play. We just can't remember what the name is. Anyway, Cathars. I like to call them Cathari, which end it with an I, like Gail was saying. It's kind of an interesting, depth of history to that. But as I was looking at what was the Cathars, or what is the Cathars, and just wanted to take just a brief opportunity to talk about that, I started asking myself what would be something that would be a real key point that kind of relates to what we do here at Sakkara. And I mean, when you look up the Wikipedia, which you can't believe in, but what you get is, it calls them the pure ones. The only real accurate information the pure is good, but the only real information they give there is the fact that they're Gnostics, which was a brief statement. They try to pacify it, but then also too, you have the notion that they were just good people that walked around and blessed you and tapped you on the head and things like that. But they were so much more. They got it accurate in saying that the pure ones, or Cathar, comes from the Greek. Well, they didn't have a choice because the Latin doesn't have their own interpretation of that too. So, needless to say, when you look at wordplay, we want to go back to its origin. So that's where I start. I start with where it works, or where it starts from. And if it's starting from the Greeks, at least the Greeks had some sense not to bury things entirely. They tried to possess it, they tried to rename it, but they kept all the gods, they just renamed them because it was nicer. And so that's what I see with the Cathari in the aspects of how we approach them today. Cathar is just the most recent term for a group that is the closest to source you can get. Isn't that what our goal is as we pursue what we're doing here, especially at Sakkara? That's why this weekend's so special. We're bringing together, this group in one accord to move the world forward as we are going through such a very ridiculous time, which tends to be something, as we look at it, might entirely be necessary. I think so, anyway. So the core seed of the Cathars is at least in more recent times, is the Merovingian element. And you've heard Mary talk about the Merovingian element being the sisters of Mary, or the daughters of Mary, which, for those of you who subscribe to this, I do, that Jesus and Mary were married. They had to be, because they were both, she was a priestess and he was a priest, both after the order of Melchizedek. And by doing so, you have this pure bloodline that at a very specific nodal point in history, when he was born, or when they were born, I should say, established a reaffirmation of source on this planet. So, and you all know the story, Mary, fled to France, was supported in France. As they started the order there, the order started to grow and become known for many attributes of, all the attributes that we practice right here. So I'll just gonna kind of give a list of some of the things that I see as being those aspects that not only do we practice, but they practice, because these are the practices that have come from source and have been here since the dawn of time. There is always a remnant, or always a small seed, that carries these attributes forward. Sometimes they become overt, sometimes they become covert. When they're covert, they're always growing, and when they're growing, they grow in strength. So for the last 700 years, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later when I talk tonight, for the last 700 years, or actually 777 years, again, 7 keeps coming up, we've seen a growing popularity, but very quietly. It's now getting ready to come forth. So some of these aspects that we find within the Cathars they were the masters of the arts of cosmology, astronomy. Okay, vibrational radiesthesia. So those of you who know me, that's the practice that I do with the special pendulum that I say can kill you, which it actually can hurt. But that was also it was a process that was reserved for the priestly class of Egypt to be the most contemporary example of that, where the priests were harbored or protected within the temples. Each temple was designed to eradicate or neutralize outside influences of what we now know as EMF. So if there was 5G then, which it wouldn't be, it would never be able to penetrate into the temples until they destroyed the temple characteristics and just let it all come in, because that was the intent, is to neutralize that information from us. But again, that seed of information is seeping out of the Akashic. It's in our midst. If you actually calculate today, by estimation, if it's true, and I'm going to subscribe to the notion that it is, if Jesus and Mary had practiced all of the precepts of what they were obligated to do under the Melchizedek, Essenian principles of priest class, it was necessary for them to bear 5 children. So you do the math. 2,000 years, 5 children, they grow, they have their own children. There's about 2.3 million, 2.5 million potential Merovingian bloodline seeds running all over the place, just, doing the cool stuff that we like to do, right? So here we are. So, obviously, alchemy, we mentioned that. Gail mentioned the alchemy aspect. I did mention astrology. But one of the things that really rang true to me is something that we do here at Sakkara, and that is they understood the science of, or I should say, the art and science of enchantment through music and chants. Okay, let me say that again. The art of enchanting through music, which is frequencies. That's why we're bombarded with the frequencies we're bombarded with. You're hearing Mary talk a lot about 5G. 5G is a very important integral aspect or an enemy to our lives, but it is actually a vibration, which is actually a song. It is music. It is a chant. It's just not a good one. There's good and there's bad. They've mastered the other side, if you want to call it, whoever you want to call them, has mastered the arts as well. We need to master them better. Mary mentioned today that if you use the Holy Grail Vortex when you're encountering these things, we all have our own individual modalities that we do. So cap it with the Holy Grail Vortex. I mean, we're here today to honor Mary and honor the precepts that she has brought into this world. That was her mission. So use it. It doesn't hurt. Let's use it. It's good. It's reinforcement. Okay? So as we look back and further in time, we look at, for instance, Plato had mentioned that the understanding of sacred science of music and chanting derived from the cosmological canon of harmonies, which is the ancient element of harmonies, the ancient frequencies. Plato actually, when he came back from Egypt after 22 or 23 years there, he said, I cannot tell the world about these frequencies. I have to withhold some, because if I do, the world's not ready for it, and it will be taken and used to literally destroy the world. As Mary's mentioned many times too, the earth cracked. It had to be stabilized by the pyramid. Okay, this is exactly what we're here to do, is to hold that space, to bring that back together. Looking at who else there was within history, the first one that comes to mind, as I mentioned, is the Egyptian priestly class. They understood the subtle arts of all harmony. They had their dowsers who did the field work. They did the water dowsing. They did the archaeological layouts and whatnot. That was all the geomantic elements. But then the priestly class, who never came out of the temples, were doing the advanced type, radiesthesia work, that they were literally designing the universe. And it established that every temple along the Nile Valley was designed to heal the body, a different part of the body or a different aspect of the body. So we have the Egyptian priestly class. Then we have, evidence of the Roman augurs. They weren't just people that cut open animals and looked at they did that, certainly. But the Roman augurs actually were called upon by the Romans in AD 70 to rebuild Jerusalem and create a harmonic grid through geomancy of that city. Now, you have 4 completely different factions, but you've never had a war in that city. And I'm not talking, I'm not saying it's great, but they were able to establish a pacification element that created harmony just through the geomancy of that. And they also used the proportions of Solomon's temple there when they did it too. The other one that really pops into my mind, which I like a lot, is the Bards of Orpheus, King Orpheus. Okay, he was a Greek king, but he had some very interesting attributes that he did. He ruled his entire kingdom just with song. In fact, it is also thought that he learned his elemental precepts from the Brahmins. So he spent time in India as well. And as we look at the passage of historical information from a paleo standpoint, we find that there's a lot in Hinduism or in that region that comes forth that we're using today. We just have, again, not gone deep enough to find out what those things are. They called them the sublime theology that Plato and Pythagoras used. We know Pythagoras by putting together all these elements of music himself as well. Also, it's referenced that Orpheus was the founder of basically Greek mythology. So here's a person that had some very interesting influence on things. One of the very interesting things that I found in some of the books, I've got books everywhere. I'm literally reading about 5 books at the same time, over and over and over again. We find there's an author by the name of John Michel. He's one of my favorites. He's an English author who's passed away recently, and he was all very much into the aspects of English geomancy, the ley lines, or ley lines as some of us has known them. But not only that, it was the attributes of the entire earth, what was going on, and as he ties them together, some really profound things come out of the of what his findings were. I'm just going to quote him real quick, and this relates to using music, as we say, Morpheus the Orphic bards used music alone to rule their kingdom, right? Sorry. I had 4 thoughts going on at the same time. I was back reading my books right now, okay? So it's like, God, okay, get a grip, okay? Here we go. Okay, so the first thing that the priestly class would do, if you ever wanted to establish a place, okay, like has been done here, the first requirement of the ruling priesthood is to occupy the naturally powerful centers of spiritual energy. Okay, you'd go out and map those out, which is what Ken had done here. He mapped out the proper location of the pyramid, of the obelisk, right? So in doing so, he said, "Thanks, I need you. It's really good." Wait, I just have to focus on Gail. Need input. Okay, this is what we call geomancy. I've already mentioned that. The search for sacred sites in relation to the spiritual energy field of the country as a whole. I call this the psychic center. Actually, John Michel does that too. I plagiarized that from him, but he won't care, he's dead. Anyway, I'm passing it on. I'm just spreading the word, but I gave reference to him, right? The psychic center, I read a bunch of different books too in relationship to this. The Nazis in World War II spent a lot of time studying geomancy and the occult arts, and one of them was studying the sacred center. Because this is where the magical rites can be most effectively utilized or amplified, and then focused out throughout the Earth grid. Some of you know the Hartmann grid. Most of us talk about ley lines, Teutonic lines, or telluric lines. These are the lines. These are the communication grid lines of Gaia. That's why. That's what Tesla was tapping into as well. He was tapping into that energy field. That's why you could literally set up an energy field here, plug your light bulb in over here in the ground, and it would literally light. So, again, as I said, the Nazis used this to control France, for instance. The first thing they did in World War II after knowing this was they drove through the Arc de Triomphe. And I probably mispronounced that, right? Or didn't. But by doing so, it showcased that they owned the sacred psychic center of the country. And the moment that happened, all France surrendered. And they just turned it over. The reason I bring up the Nazis is they're the most recent circumstance of utilizing this information. But there was another class that happened after the demise or after the Cathars were basically wiped out. Obviously, as we've mentioned, they grew in such popularity that at the time of their full, strength, they were about 50 million Cathars. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that was all the priestly class. The priestly class was very, very, very small. I think I calculated it was like 1/100% of the Cathars, or people that considered themselves followers of Catharism, were the priestly class. So it's very small. Again, it's very small seeds that keep this thing preserved. After their martyrdom, then the Cistercian monks came into play, which is a key note that happens with, let's call it the dark side. They take what we know and they use it. This is why we have to bind together to preserve what we know, what we're doing, not to be afraid to share it, but to know that we have to have that in a cohesive manner. What is documented that the Cistercian monks would do after the Cathars were, removed, there was a lot of destruction. So the Cistercian monks then would go in, they would find again those sacred spots. After they would just literally find a spot, camp out, and start chanting. It's how they ended up starting to repopulate the regions, but they were repopulating it with the programming that they wanted the people to know. So it kept a suppression. It kept them down. It kept them, functionally illiterate, as it were. And it's just another example. And then they buried all the information, which is what we've seen happen. And then changed pronunciations. I'll give you a quick example of that, and then I'll close because I'm sure I'm rambling on a little bit too far here. Actually, before I say that, Shakespeare was another one that has been utilizing the precepts of the Cathars. If some of you have seen some of the programs, which are really kind of cool, it is suggested that Sir Francis Bacon was actually Shakespeare. And Sir Francis Bacon was a Rosicrucian, so that was a very secret society that generated these precepts and kept them moving forward. They actually called Shakespeare the Bard of Avon. So they became known as poets, right? And this is how everything went obscure. So for the last 700 years, these things have been obscure, but we've been seeing little pockets of individuals popping up, whether it's Leonardo da Vinci, whether it's James Keeley, whether it's, Tesla himself and others, Madame Blavatsky. There was a huge movement, that moved these things forward. So at that point, the reason I brought this picture up is because when I looked at this picture, the first thing that I saw is that this is a sword in a valley of cups. Sit up still. Yeah. Right? They picked a sword, an antenna system, to then that pulls that information back down into the earth, into the valley. It amplifies it as a parabolic dish and sends that information out to all the regions. This established peace everywhere. There was continuity. There was everyone flourished. There was abundance. There was interaction, and it spread all the way across, Europe. All the way, it was all the way to the, southern, the eastern regions of Russia, southeastern Russia. There was a lot of interaction with this. Thus, it took a very concerted effort to try to suppress it, but it didn't. The good news is it didn't. The seed is always preserved. Source always preserves that. And that's why we're here today. So actually, I'd like to give a hand to Mary for organizing all this, because this is a group that is really important for all of this. And on that, I think I'll close, because otherwise I could just go on and on forever. Thanks.